Guys, welcome back to my painting channel. My name is Stoof. Today we're going to do part 2 of 2. Here's the finished painting for you guys. I'm not totally done with this one, but this is where we're going to finish off the painting for the tutorial because it's close enough, right? If you guys want to do anything additional past this point, you're welcome to add more detail if you recreate this one and you would like to add more detail. But this is where we finish off after part 2. This tutorial is not going to be in real time because I put a little bit more time into this than I expected, as usual. So I'm going to be fast forwarding the very repetitive parts or parts where there isn't any audio of me describing what I'm doing. And that should be enough for you to keep working and get some tips with the colors and the brush strokes. Alright guys, let's dive into this tutorial. Alright, so this is where we left off with part 1. I basically just covered the entire painting with a base layer of paint. I started with like a brown earthy wash and then put all my colors over top of that. So everything's either like a shadow tone or like a mid-tone right now. Nothing is at like the super brightest highlight that it's going to be, except for maybe this section of the waterfall. But we're going to start by working with the background, moving to the foreground the same way we did step 1. Maybe I'll bounce around a little bit here or there if I get bored somewhere, but for the most part, starting in the background, coming to the foreground, starting with lightening up these clouds, and then starting to add some detail back in here, and just making our way to the foreground. Today we're going to be using about the same colors we used in part 1 for this painting tutorial, but to go over these again, there are a couple different ones. Today we're going to use green gold, sap green, phthalo green, blue shade, phthalo blue, ultramarine blue, dioxazine purple, ivory black, titanium white. This is just like a neutral tone I have. This is burnt umber, burnt sienna, magenta, alizarin crimson, cadmium red light, cadmium yellow light, cadmium yellow medium, and this one is like a terra rosa or light red is another version of that, but it's like a little bit more red than burnt sienna. And I also added some yellow ochre right there. I'm going to start with this fine round tipped brush and just start kind of puffing up the clouds and adding little bits of highlight in there. And we're going to use some pure white mixed with a tiny hint of ivory black. And I don't have a ton of paint on the brush here. It's not like a full dry brush effect, but I'm not really thinning the paint down or doing anything to really thickly apply the paint. Now I'm just adding the paint, brushing it around in little circle motions to get the puffy cloud texture. And I'm pushing relatively hard on the canvas here just to get that paint pushed around because I don't have too much paint on the canvas. So I have to push a little harder to get that paint to move. I dipped it in my citrus solvents just a little to thin down this paint. And now I'm doing more of a dry brush where I took the extra paint off my brush and I'm just letting it glide. Gonna add a little bit of ultramarine blue and ivory black. A little more ivory black there. And let's do like a tiny dab of phthalo. Now we have a kind of a darker shadow over here. Getting a little more citrus solvents on my brush to thin that paint down, and then taking the extra paint off my brush, very lightly pressing the canvas now. And we want to keep playing with these little hints of highlight and shadow where we have like thicker puffs of shadowy section of cloud. That's going to help to build the depth in our cloud, make it look less flat. So as you can see, the variations in color are very subtle in clouds. We don't have a whole big dramatic change in these clouds between highlight and shadow because these are just normal little puffy clouds. If this was a rain cloud or like a cumulonimbus cloud, we'd probably have a little more contrast. I'm very, very gently pressing here. Just trying to get a couple little hints of more puffiness from some like translucent looking clouds. And we'll brighten up this cloud back here using white with that little hint of ivory and my little neutral color, dipping the brush in a little bit of citrus solvent just to thin that paint down. And this cloud has a little bit more of a definite boundary. It's it's puffy, but it's not like puffy, translucent, breaking apart puffy. We've got our brightest highlight at the top of that cloud, and then a couple like middle highlights. I'm gonna take a little more ochre and black and like a hint of ultramarine, maybe a hint of umber in there too. Just really subtle. Yep, that's great. And just start to kind of build down into more of the shadowy colors. Take a little bit of the phthalo with your white. Start to kind of carry that color over here. Gets just a little bit more blue over here. Got a little highlight down there. Clouds are starting to disperse a little more over here, so I'm loosening up the boundary between the cloud and the sky by just lightly swirling the brush around with a little bit of minerals or citrus solvents on it. I'm going back to our shadow color, which is like a little ultramarine, a little bit of umber, a little ivory, tiny, tiny dab of phthalo. Ominous down here, a little darker shadow. You don't always see, I guess you don't usually see this, where the shadow for the cloud in the distance is actually darker than the shadow for the cloud in the foreground. It's a little bit more like rainy clouds back there. Take a little highlight down under here. Take a little more of our shadow color here. Adding a little more phthalo. kind of just fuzzing right over those trees. All right, and I think that's basically good for the sky. We might come back and touch a couple things up, but for now let's move down to this section over here is our tree line. That's the farthest in the background. So we're gonna start with some sap green and ultramarine blue and some magenta. Blend some white in there. Gonna go a little higher with my sap green. And let's see. This section right here is in shadow under the clouds, so I'm going to make it a little more brown and ultramarine blue. And I'm just going to put that color down. This thing that's maybe like a tad too dark, so I'm going to add a little more white and ultramarine. If you remember from the first video, I was talking about how sometimes when you take a photograph, it'll flatten out your image and it'll kind of even out all your shadows a little bit differently than you would perceive it in nature. So that's what we're doing here. We're going to make this a little lighter than what we see in the picture. So basically, we've got this ridge. Goes to like right about here. And you can just see the little stubbles from the tops of the trees. So I'm still using my round tip brush. You could switch to a flat tip brush if you want. But these are so stubbly and small that either brush would be okay. All right, and that's the section that's in shadow. I'm just gonna pull that color down a little bit. And then we got a couple little trees here. I'm gonna take some of my green gold, white, and some ultramarine blue just to tone down that color a little. What else? Maybe a hint of crimson red. Using a cool red. It's a good color, and we're going to use that. Just dipping my brush in the citrus solvents a tiny bit just to get a little more maneuverability with the brush, and just start to add a couple more little trees here. This part's not in shadow. And same with this side of the tree line. If you need to kind of get the shape of your hillside again, your hill slope, you can sketch that in with the brush and then just add some little stubbles on top of it for the trees. Trees kind of come down a little here. And then there's a section back here that's even farther in the distance, and we're going to use some phthalo blue there with white and ultramarine blue and some magenta. Let this kind of fade off. I guess we want to go a little lighter. Kind of fades off into the clouds here. So I'm going to get that one hill slip there. I'm going to clean my brush off. I'm going to add a little bit of black to white and make a value slightly lighter than what I just did. And we're going to carry this line over a little bit and put a little line there. Clean off the brush and then blend that. You can add a little more white in there too, like cloud color. That's a really faded, hazy line there. Just fades right off into the clouds. The only thing you really see is like the ridge there, the left side of that slope. All right, and then we've got a little one back here coming this way. So I'm assuming this is the river valley and it kind of flows this way. I don't remember from being there myself, but I'm assuming that's what I'm painting here. And then we're just gonna take some more of our sky color and kind of fudge that up a little. Then we're going to take some ultramarine. And build this one up a little closer. And this slope kind of comes at an angle like that. Just going to fill all that space in. And I'll take a little more ultramarine blue and sap green because we're starting to get closer here. Can add some more trees. And this part's all in shadow too. Adding even more phthalo blue in there. A little bit of umber. And things, I can see like a tiny little hint of something back here. So I'm just gonna add a little bit of something there for like that ridge that I can just barely see. And I'm gonna soften these up a little bit because they're kind of in shadow. Well, not in shadow, they're kind of hidden in the mist a little bit. And then firm up a few of them in the foreground. All right, back to that lighter green, sap green color. Now we've got a bigger shadow in here, which I'm going to make a little less extreme. So I'm taking some phthalo blue, some sap green and magenta, and a hint of umber. And let's do some ultramarine too. And we're going to add a little white and add this shadow right in here. And we're going to add a little more sap green to our other little green color. Kind of build up a little bit of a shadow on the side of the slope where it leads into this shadow. All right, and then we've got like a highlight coming down this slope here. So we're going to take more of a green, gold, white, a little sap green, some crimson. And we'll do a little bit of ochre and some ultramarine. A little more ochre. Take some brown or umber with our sap green and a little bit of phthalo green. And we'll do a little bit of cadmium red light there too. And blend a little bit of our green gold in there and just put this at the base of this line of trees, just doing zigzags up and down, kind of build some little shadows, just keeping that up and down motion, getting a little more umber and ultramarine. Gonna switch to this brush now. This is my short bristled flat tip brush. Take a little more phthalo, ultramarine, and crimson. A little burnt umber too. And now we're starting to get some real shadows in between the trees there. And we can really start to see the individual trees here. So I'm just taking my flat tip brush, holding it right at the painting and just going up. And now I'm going to switch to this brush here. It's another fine round tip brush, but this one has a little bit longer of a bristle level, and it's a little bit finer than this one that I was using before. Taking more of my green gold and a little bit of cadmium yellow medium and some crimson. Also taking some sap green. Can start adding some highlights in here. So this brush gives me a little more control than the other two. Gives me a couple finer lines. Gives me just, it allows me to make finer lines than the other ones. And there's actually some mist from like either from the waterfall or just like rising from the valley in here. And it's kind of like making it look hazy in this area. So I'm gonna have to do that after all of this dries. So you guys won't see that, maybe when I show you the finished painting, you'll see that little bit of mist. Basically what happens is I'm gonna do this detail here, gonna let that dry, and then I'm gonna do the same thing I did for the clouds right here to add a little bit of mist over everything by thinning down the paint with the citrus solvents and making little circle motions. And I'm going to start, actually real quick, I'm going to take this short bristled flat tip brush and I'm going to block in a little section of rock I see. So I'm going to mix some white with ochre and my Terra Rosa or light red color. And I'm just going to block this in like right about from this little lip here. It kind of comes at a diagonal up. Don't go past this section. And it comes in about there, a little bit of exposed rock, and same thing on this side, except we have more cadmium yellow and red, and this one's a little farther down. Kind of don't go past this low section of the waterfall. Now we know where those rocks are, and we can keep adding the trees. So now I'm going to take this liner brush and I'm going to start working on some of the details in the river. I'm going to take some phthalo green, phthalo blue, and umber. And a little white too, so it's not too dark. We're gonna add this little shadow right here. And I guess it comes over to like right here. Got like a little bit of a green gold color mixed with phthalo green in the waterfall. There we go, now the waterfall is starting to come to life. And we can do a little highlight. I'm going to take some of our white with the cadmium red, cadmium yellow, and a little bit of the terra rosa, a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of umber, and put that color right above the shadow you did at the edge of the water. And then we've got some trees in here with some shadow, so we're going to take some umber, sap green, and phthalo blue, and let's do a little magenta as well, and a little ultramarine. And that is going to be, you know what, let's take like a tiny bit of ochre too, so it's not too like dark yet. That's better. Okay, and then this, basically we've just got some trees in here that needs some shadows. Some of these are pretty big trees. So the shadows are mostly on the right, the right side of the trees here. I think I made that rock just like a little bit too low. I'm gonna bring it up a little. Take some more umber and ultramarine. Kind of put that at the base. Just kind of, still using my liner brush, kind of wiggling the paintbrush around to get a little bit of detail in there, taking a little bit of white with my warmer colors. And I'm just adding some little dabs of white there. And I'll take some umber, add some shadows in there. Then we gotta do the shadows behind this rock. So I'm just gonna line the edge of that. And using our tree shadow color, just doing some shadows in there. And let's start to add some shadows in this section over here. So I'm gonna take more of my sap green, my ultramarine, a little bit of phthalo, and some magenta and umber. And these shadows are getting really dark. I think I'm gonna just add a teeny tiny dab of white and a little more umber. Just make sure you don't overdo your highlights, like you still want to leave some shadow space here so these trees have some depth. And if you did overdo it on your highlights, you can always go back and add more shadows, and that's what I'm gonna end up doing here. So I'm making this a little too light. Gonna take a little more sap green and some magenta. A little more magenta over here. Gonna add a little bit of ochre and cadmium yellow medium to my green. So it's starting to kind of come to life over here. There are a lot more shadows that need to get put in there, but I think I'm going to start working on this rock a bit, and then I'll go back into this area. There's like a little section, I'm just mixing some white with umber and sienna and the dioxazine purple, and there's a little section in here that has some exposed rock peeking through, so I'm just going to put that little bit there so I don't forget that that's visible. And there's another little bit right here. There we go. Alright, coming back over here. We're going to start right here and build up some highlights on that. So I'm going to clean off my brush, and we're going to take some white, mix it with our cadmium yellow light and a little bit of red. Nice and bright. And I'm just gonna lighten that up a tad more. And we'll just start right at the edge, just holding the brush so we can get a nice, firm, defined edge and contact point between this and what we see behind it. And this slope is about a 45-degree angle to about there. Then we start to mix a little bit of gray into the rock here. Not going too much darker in value, but starting to lose that saturation and get cooler. And getting a little darker towards the bottom. Then we got a little bit of red and cadmium yellow medium in here. That's pretty. And I think I want to touch this up a little here. I want to add like a shadowy color that's not all the way in shadow. Take a little bit of black with my umber and purple. A little bit of ultramarine, and kind of touch up this edge here. It's like this, there's like this rock ledge, and then it's casting a shadow onto the water behind it. Then we'll take some more of our burnt sienna and some dioxazine purple. Start to use that down here. Actually, we need some white and black blended in with those two colors. And a little more purple. A little more black. A little more. Let's do some ochre. Yeah, that's pretty good. That color's just right here. And this color kind of comes up at an angle. Basically fills in the space. And there are some little highlights over that that have burnt sienna and cadmium yellow light, cadmium yellow medium, and white. I'll just add these little scattered spots in here. Taking even more burnt sienna and cadmium yellow medium. Got a little contact here, little color change. And then it gets lighter again, so let's take some white with ochre and cadmium yellow medium. It's pretty close. At this point, I'm taking a closer look at my reference photo and refining the shapes and the colors of these slopes coming down into the river. I'm starting to further refine those little edges of the river to get the shape more accurate, adding some puffiness to the base of the falls where we have all of that steam rising up, using my short bristled flat tip brush and just putting some white paint on there. And then I switched to my liner brush and I thin that paint down with some citrus solvents and just use some pure white, but it's really thinned down so it doesn't look super bright here. You can even add a little bit of ivory black if you don't want it to be too bright. And I just start to like kind of scribble it around and create some white water on the river. Then I take a little bit of phthalo green and white and a little bit of yellow and just scribble that around the edges just to get that choppy water looking a little more realistic. Then I move over to the slope on the right side of the falls there, and I covered up where I initially put those trees down because you can kind of see through the trees, and rather than take a small brush and put little specks of that background color in there, I decided to just cover up the trees and then we'll add the trees again later. So I'm speeding it up here a little bit as I work on these rocks because it's a repetitive process, but basically you're going to continue to do the same thing for each of these different rock units, moving closer to the viewer. You're going to have that base layer already down, then you're going to start to add those little shadows for the little cracks and crevices in the rock, and then the rusty stains where we have more of our burnt siennas in there, and then add the highlights where we have a little bit more cadmium yellow light with white, and keep going back and forth, adding more shadows and tiny little highlights and just continuing to refine the rock face until it reads accurately. And for the sections of rock where you have shadows, you just want to make sure you're using ultramarine blue with maybe some ivory, maybe some dioxazine purple, maybe some burnt umber, and our shadows are continuing to get darker and there's more contrast as we move closer to the foreground. Here I'm starting to build up those little caps of like little ledges that are just above the shadow line, and I'm just starting to put those right over my deeper shadows in there. Some of these sections are in shadow and I used ultramarine blue with white, but they weren't like a super dark deep shadow, and then other little sections were super bright and illuminated with sunlight, and I used my liner brush for all of this. It all comes down to just looking at what you see in the reference photograph and playing around with adding highlights and shadows and seeing how the values work with each other. If something starts to stand out way too much, then you want to darken it down a little bit or lighten it up depending on if you made it too dark or too light, and just keep going from there. Here I'm starting to add more trees using my fine liner brush, and I'm just doing a straight line down for the trunk and a couple squiggles back and forth, getting a little wider at the bottom for each tree just to show some little branches. And as you're moving closer to the viewer, remember that the trees are going to get bigger, there's going to be more contrast, darker shadows, and you can see more detail in the branches and limbs. So I'm going in, just starting to add more shadows at first, and then we'll go back later and we'll add some highlights over top of that. Now I'm moving to this rock in the foreground. So basically everything on the left side of the rock is lit up by the sun for the most part, and then everything on the right side of the rock is more in shadow. So we're using cooler tones for the shadowy part of the rock, and for the warmer part of the rock we're using some warmer colors like our cadmium red lights, our burnt siennas, some cadmium yellow mediums in there. And then on the cooler side we have more ultramarine blue, white, like raw umber or a burnt umber. Just make sure that you cool that down more with your blues. You can add some ivory black in there too. So I'm just blending some white with some cadmium yellow light and a little bit of burnt umber. And we're going to use this right here. Just starting to lighten things up. Kind of pulling this color up. Getting a little bit of sienna mixed in there as well. Very gently pressing. A little purple, dioxazine purple. I'll add some of that there. And then we've got some like sienna with like a little bit of red right here. It's really bright, vibrant. All right, now moving closer, let's get back to that. White with a little bit of umber and cadmium yellow light. And we'll add a little cadmium yellow medium there too. All right, I'll take some more dioxazine purple with umber and our white and yellow combo too. A little bit of sienna. And I'll take just some straight umber and put that at the top there. Define that shape a little bit more. And then we need a shadow color, so we're just going to take some sap green, phthalo blue, and ivory black. And we'll just start to add a few little shadows in there. Kind of start to see the individual branches over here. Got a couple smaller ones too. Adding a little more purple and umber towards the bottom. And a little more white. And a couple spots, like little highlights on the hillside there. And we'll take a little bit of ultramarine with our burnt umber. Put that closer to the base. Kind of coming up this next ledge closer to the viewer. Get blending a little bit of our sienna in there. And some more white. Mixing a little bit of cadmium red light and cadmium yellow medium, just to add a little bit more warmth. And we're going to take some burnt umber with a tiny bit of ultramarine blue, and we're just going to outline this edge here. Just kind of build up the shadow behind it. I'm going to add a few more highlights here too. In a few of these trees you can just see the actual tree stump. So I'm just blending some white with a little tiny bit of dioxazine purple and ultramarine blue, and there's a little bit of yellow already there. And we're going to add a couple tree trunks, just very lightly. You really can't see all of them. Some of them are in shadow a little bit, so you can blend in a little bit of umber and blue for those ones. They don't quite stand out as much. If you already put like the branches off to the sides of the trunk, you can just add the little trunk line like that. Make sure that they aren't all oriented perfectly up and down, like some of them are going to be slanted a little bit. After adding more of the stumps for the trees or the trunks, then I moved over to the left side of the falls and added some highlights for the pine trees farther in the distance, and then started to build up some more shadows on the rock, adding more detail to that rock slope in the left foreground coming down, starting to add some highlights for little sections of the top of the rock that was illuminated with sunlight, and then adding my pine trees and their shadows to that slope as well. So your shadows are going to have that cooler blue purple tone, and your trees are going to start with more of like the sap green and umber colors, and then you can add some highlights to those trees too on top of the shadow. Just make sure you don't forget to put the shadow of the tree at like a 45-degree angle on the right side of your tree. If your trees don't have shadows, then they're not going to read realistically. And now I'm just taking my liner brush and adding lots of detail to these little trees. Just making each little branch stick out by making these little crisscross zigzaggy patterns around the section where the tree trunk would be gathering around. And again, we want to mix up our greens here, so start adding little bits of other colors to your green for each tree so they all stand out from one another just a little bit. And we got to go back and add some shadows in these little trees too. I always like to start at the tops with these trees, and then as I'm working my way down, I will start to get a little darker with the brush as it kind of blends in with those shadow colors behind it. So it starts out really light with the top of the tree like I want, and then as I keep working down, it kind of just gets darker on its own. And you can always build in more shadows if you need to, like this, and always build up more highlights over top of them. And I'm thinning down my paint, in case you haven't noticed that yet. That helps me to get more defined tree, branches. Adding some more little shadows in here. I made it a little too light. Just doesn't stick out enough. And you can take some of our sap green and phthalo blue. It's kind of fill in the spaces in between these two. Makes them stand out a little better. And on this rock, this line here is where everything to this side is in light and everything on this side is in shadow. So when you're transitioning this color over, you kind of get like a section where it's almost neutral and then it kind of gets cooler. So we start to blend in some rose, some dioxazine purple, some black, a little bit of white. And just kind of carry this color down. So it goes warm, neutral, cool. Same thing here, kind of get a little bit more of that. And I'll take just some black. Play around with these shadows again. And I'm going to switch over to this brush, my angled flat tip brush, and we'll add some more blue. So I'm mixing ultramarine blue with phthalo blue and black. Yeah, we'll do a little bit of sienna in there too. And we got this nice color. Can add a little more black. And you can kind of just take your black and start to add a couple random little fractures in the rock and some deepen up some shadows. Just keep your brush very light on the canvas, don't press too hard. You're going to get really thick, dark lines. Kind of just want to make this rock look like more speckled with dots of lichen and things, and kind of carry around the color so it's not boring to look at. And with the rocks, you kind of just keep dabbing paint around and playing with it until you feel like it looks realistic. It can take a while, especially when you have a rock like this right in the foreground that's pretty detailed. I think I said somewhere in this video that I wasn't going to focus on this rock too much, but here I am. Next, I'm just taking my liner brush and starting to add more highlights to the pine trees all around the painting, wherever I see a spot that looks like it needs a little highlight, and then building up a couple more shadows in between those spots too, where things look like they are too green, like just to get a little more separation. Starting to add a couple little pine trees that are on the slope on the far right there. Adding a few more shadows in the pine trees behind the waterfall on the left side, then on the left slopes in front of the waterfall, adding some highlights again, trying to find that balance between shadow and highlight where I don't have like a blob of green anywhere. I want to have separation between all the trees. The last thing we're going to do is just touch up the highlights on this waterfall. So we're just going to put some pure white little circles here. Don't cover the entire waterfall with pure white. Just enough that you've got those highlights that you need. And just a couple little highlights on this mist. Now we can kind of roll this mist up. Maybe do a few more little swirlies down here to get this looking extra misty. There we go. And we're gonna call that finished for now. I see a few more hours that I'm gonna put into this painting for finishing it as a fine art piece for an exhibition, but for educational purposes and for a tutorial, I think that covers the basics. The only things that I'm still planning to do are refining details throughout the entire painting. So this is pretty much where we're going to stop with this tutorial. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. If you have any recommendations or ideas for future painting tutorials, leave a comment below and I'll add that to my list of things to paint. And if you guys recreate this painting yourself, then you can post it on your Instagram and tag me, the painting Stoof, so that I can see it. I love seeing everybody's work when they recreate my paintings. It brightens my day to see you guys recreating my work, and it makes me feel like everything I do with my tutorials is worth it when I see that you guys enjoy them. So thanks again for watching, guys. Have a great day and happy painting. Bye bye.